The sun was barely cresting over the horizon when the dust began to rise on the edge of the valley. The little town still slept, its single main street lined with weathered wooden buildings and a few stubborn lanterns flickering low. But out by the ranch the day had already begun. The land was harsh, dry and wild, and it demanded the same from anyone who dared to live on it. Men who tried to tame it often broke under its weight, and women who came west expecting soft comforts soon found themselves wishing they had never left. Home, the whispers about the rancher carried far and wide. Folks in town liked to talk when the evenings grew long, and they swore no mail-order bride ever lasted more than a week under his roof. Some said he was too harsh to wild himself, raised by a people and a land that didn't bend to anyone's rules but their own. Others whispered it was the silence in his house, the long stretches of wordless nights and endless workdays that ground women down until they begged for the next wagon out. A few claimed it was his eye sharp, unyielding, always watching. Whatever the reason, each bride who arrived by train and carriage never stayed. A week, sometimes less, and she was gone. So when the next woman stepped off the coach, the townsfolk had their bets ready. She was different, they admitted, but they said the same every time. She carried herself with a stubborn kind of grace, her back straight, her eyes meeting stares instead of dropping to the ground. She wore a black dress that looked too heavy for the heat, but she didn't flinch as the dust rose around her boots. No one thought she would last either. They never did. He stood waiting near the edge of town, the kind of man who drew every eye without trying. His frame was strong, tall, the muscles earned from years of work beneath the sun. His dark hair was tied back neatly, his shirt simple but fitted to his build. And he carried the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. The people called him the Apache rancher, but most of them had never dared to ask where exactly he came from or what stories lived in his past. All they knew was that the land seemed to know him, and he knew it. Their meeting was not warm. It wasn't supposed to be. A man like him did not promise affection, and a woman like her did not expect it. She crossed her arms as he approached, the hard lines of her mouth making it clear she would not be spoken down to. He studied her the way he might study a wild horse, gauging if she was all fight or if there was enough steel to carry her through the storms. The wind carried silence between them, and in that silence was a tension no one else could miss. The old log house waited behind them, its frame standing strong against years of storms. Though the dust swirled around it like a warning, she looked at it, then back at him, and something in her eyes hardened. This was not the life she had dreamed of, and yet something in her refused to turn away. She had left too much behind to come here, only to flee like the others. The townsfolk watched from shaded porches and dusty windows, whispering as the pair made their way back toward the ranch. Bets were exchanged quietly, and knowing glances passed between old-timers who claimed they had seen this scene too many times before. "She'll be gone in a week," one muttered, shaking his head. "Mark my words," another leaned back in his chair with a grin. 3 days. She looks proud, but pride don't stand a chance against him. Out on the trail, the silence between them was heavy. He did not speak unless words were necessary, and she refused to fill the air with nervous chatter. The only sound was the creak of leather and the steady beat of hooves as they moved further away from town and closer to the landless stretch of land he called home. She had heard stories of how harsh this country could be. She had heard, too, that he kept no mercy for weakness. But as the house came into view again, standing solitary against the wide horizon, she felt a pull she could not explain. The land was empty, yes, but it was alive. The air was sharp with the scent of sage, and the wind carried a song that felt older than the buildings in town. It frightened her, and yet it steadied her. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she was meant to be tested here. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, and steady. "If you've come for an easy life, you've come to the wrong place." Her chin lifted, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "If I'd wanted easy, I would have stayed where I was." For the first time, the corner of his mouth threatened something that could almost be called a smile. Not soft, not gentle, but the faintest flicker of recognition. As if maybe, just maybe, he saw something in her the others had lacked, The days ahead would not be kind. She knew that already. The land was hard, the work relentless, and the man beside her a storm she could not yet measure. But she also knew she would not run, not yet. Perhaps not ever. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. The shadows lengthened across the ground, and the first call of a coyote echoed from the hills. She felt it deep inside. The story was only beginning, and whatever lay ahead would demand more than she had ever given before. But this time, unlike all the others, she was not going to turn back. She had heard the tales. No mail-order bride lasted 1 week with the Apache rancher. She intended to prove them wrong. But as she followed him into the shadow of the old cabin, a sudden gust of wind swept through the valley, rattling the shutters and sending a shiver through her. She could not know then that the first test was already waiting, closer than she imagined. Something stirred beyond the line of cottonwoods, something neither of them yet saw. And before the week was out, both the woman and the rancher would face a choice that could break them or bind them. Forever. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the scent of wood smoke and earth greeting them inside. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping across the threshold, her heart steady, her eyes sharp. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant thunder, but it wasn't from the sky. The door shut behind her with a weight that made her feel as if she had crossed into a different world entirely. The air inside the cabin was cooler, touched with the scent of cedar and smoke, and yet it carried a heaviness that settled in her chest. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her boots, and her eyes swept over the room, simple, sturdy, without the faintest touch of comfort beyond what necessity required. A table scarred from years of use stood near the hearth. The stone fireplace still held the faint glow of morning embers, and a single shelf along the far wall bore only the basics: a tin cup, a few plates, and a single kerosene lamp. This was no home meant to charm or ease a woman's heart. It was a place of survival. He set down his hat on the table, the silence between them lingering like an unspoken test. His movements were steady, precise, as though he was careful not to waste anything, not words, not time, not even the strength in his hands. He glanced at her only once, as if measuring her against the weight of the life ahead. Before stepping toward the fireplace to coax the coals back to flame, she stood in the center of the room, her arms tightening around herself. She could still feel the weight of the stares from the town, the whispering about how long she would last. They had all expected her to turn and run before she even reached this cabin, and perhaps part of her wished she could. But she had crossed too many miles, and given up too many hopes to allow fear to rule her now. "I'll need water from the well," he said finally. His voice deep but quiet, almost blending with the low crackle of the fire. "Buckets are out back." She lifted her chin. It was not a request, it was an order, and yet there was no cruelty in the way he said it. Still, it was a command from a man used to being obeyed. Without a word, she moved toward the door again. The wind outside caught at her skirt as she stepped into the sunlight, and she paused for a moment on the porch. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, the kind of vastness that made a person feel small and unanchored. The air was drier than anything she'd known before, the dust curling around her boots as she walked toward the well. The wooden handle was rough in her hand, the bucket heavy even before it filled with water. She drew it up slowly, her arms straining, the muscles in her shoulders burning from the effort. By the time she carried it back into the cabin, her breath had quickened, but she did not let him see her struggle. He looked up briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement in his dark eyes. Before turning back to the fire, "Set it there," he said. She placed the bucket beside the hearth, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. The silence stretched again, heavy and unyielding, till she finally spoke. "You've had others before me," she said quietly, not as a question but as a statement. His hand paused over the kindling. The firelight cast sharp shadows across his features, but he didn't look at her when he answered. "Yes, and none of them stayed." "No." She waited, but he said nothing more. He was a man who gave only what was necessary, nothing beyond that. The weight of his silence pressed on her. But instead of shrinking under it, she let it fuel her resolve. If he thought she was weak, if he thought she would crumble like the others, he would be wrong. She crossed her arms, standing as tall as she could in the center of that stark room. And though he didn't raise his eyes, she felt the tension shift. That night, she lay awake on a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The mattress was little more than a rough sack stuffed with straw, the thin quilt worn from years of use. The wind howled faintly outside, rattling the shutters, and every sound in the dark pressed against her nerves. She listened for the steady breath of the man on the other side of the cabin, but it was lost beneath the storm of her own thoughts. She thought of the women before her. Had they been stronger than she? Softer? More willing to bow? Had they wept into their pillows until dawn and begged for a way back east? The thought burned in her chest, but she set her jaw against it. She was not them. She would not be them. Yet, as the hours passed, another unease began to grow. It was not only the man she had to face. The land itself seemed alive, restless, carrying whispers through the night air that she could not understand. The distant thunder she had heard earlier still echoed faintly in her ears. Though the sky outside remained clear, by morning the work began. He gave her no instructions beyond what was necessary. The chores were endless: water to be drawn, wood to be split, animals to be tended. She had never known such labor, but she did not complain. She bit down against the ache in her hands, the sting of blisters rising across her palms, and forced herself to keep pace. Each time she glanced toward him, she found him watching, not with cruelty, but with a measuring stillness that unsettled her even more than harsh words would have. At midday, as the sun blazed overhead, he stopped her with a single raised hand. "Rest," he said simply. She sank onto the porch steps, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her breath. He stood beside the corral, one hand resting on the worn rail, his gaze fixed on the horses within. They shifted uneasily, as if sensing something in the air. "What do they fear?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "They hear what we don't." A chill passed through her, though the heat of the day was heavy. She wanted to press him, to ask what he meant, but something in his tone told her he would not answer. Or perhaps she wasn't ready for the answer. That night the unease deepened. As the sun slipped behind the hills, the ranch grew quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The coyotes did not howl. The wind seemed to hold its breath, and the shadows stretched longer than they should have. She sat near the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and though she did not speak, her heart pounded with a strange awareness she could not name. He sat across from her, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The steady scrape of steel against stone filled the silence until she could bear it no longer. "There's something out there," she whispered, his eyes lifted, meeting hers. For the first time, she saw something in them that unsettled her more than his silence, something that looked almost like caution. "There's always something out there," he said. The fire crackled between them, the shadows swaying against the walls. She felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, heavy as stone. The land was testing her, yes, but something more lurked in the darkness beyond those cottonwoods, something that might not be content to wait. She turned her gaze to the door, half expecting it to open on its own, half dreading what might step through if it did. And in that moment, she knew the week ahead would not only test her will against the man who stood beside her, it would test her against whatever haunted this land itself. For the first time since she had arrived, she wondered if the whispers in town had left out the most dangerous truth of all. The days that followed began to blur together, each one shaped by the same rhythm of labor and silence. Morning light meant water to be drawn, fire to be stoked, and animals to be tended before the heat rose high enough to press the breath from her lungs. Afternoon meant more work, mending, hauling, keeping pace with chores that seemed to multiply like weeds. And evening brought the hush of the prairie, the shadows lengthening as though the land itself wished to remind them both that they were only guests on ground far, older than their lives. But beneath that rhythm, tension grew. It was not only between them, though that alone could have split stone. It was the land, the silence, and something unspoken that seemed to ride in with the wind each night. She noticed it in small ways at first. The horses shifted nervously at dusk, ears pricking toward the cottonwoods that lined the distant creek. The dog, a rangy creature that had claimed the porch as his, Territory sometimes growled low in his throat when the night was too still, and always the man's eyes would turn toward the hills, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, though he said nothing. She wanted to ask what he feared, but pride held her tongue. She had learned quickly that he was a man of few words, and those words were not wasted on speculation or comfort. Still, her mind filled the silence with questions. Was it raiders? Outlaws? Or something older, something the land itself carried in its bones? Her own conflict lay closer to hand. The work was unrelenting, and though she met it with stubbornness, her body bore the price. Her hands blistered, her back ached, and every night she lay awake wondering if she had the strength to rise again at dawn. She thought of the women who had come before her and how quickly they had broken. Had they known, in the quiet of their own hearts, that they would not last? Or had they too sworn they would stay until the land and the silence drove them to surrender? It was not only her pride that kept her from giving in. It was the way he watched her. His silence was not empty. It was measuring. He looked at her as though he was waiting, testing, trying to decide if she would bend or if she would stand. That gaze both unnerved and steadied her, for she knew if she faltered, he would not stop her from leaving. He would not beg, nor argue, nor even look back as she walked away. One evening, when the sun hung low and the sky burned red, she found herself staring at the cottonwoods that marked the edge of their land. The wind rattled their leaves like a warning, and a shiver crawled across her arms despite the heat. Something out there, she murmured to herself. His voice came from behind, quiet but certain. Always, she turned to find him standing a few paces away, arms folded, eyes fixed on the same line of trees. "What is it?" she asked. He was silent for a long while. Then he said, "The land remembers. Some things don't forget." His words stirred more questions than answers, but she saw in his face that pressing him further would yield nothing. Instead, she carried his words like a stone in her pocket, heavy and ever-present. The townsfolk became their own subplot to the story. When she rode into town one Saturday with him to trade for supplies, she felt every eye on her. The women whispered from doorways, the men leaned against hitching posts with knowing smirks. The same question lived on every face. How long before she fled? She met their stares with steady eyes, refusing to show the cracks beneath her skin. Still, the weight of their doubt gnawed at her. The blacksmith's wife muttered as she passed, "Poor thing, won't last through the week." Her chest burned, but she kept her chin high. Later, when she carried a sack of flour out to the wagon, she caught him watching her. He said nothing, but she thought she saw the faintest flicker of approval in his gaze, like a shadow moving behind stone. Back at the ranch, the days grew hotter, the nights quieter. The unease deepened with each sunset. Once, while drawing water, she heard a low sound drifting from beyond the creek. Not the cry of a coyote or the call of an owl, but something deeper, almost human, carried thin on the wind. She froze, the bucket trembling in her hands, and by the time she looked back toward the cabin, she saw him standing on the porch. Eyes locked on the same direction. He did not ask what she had heard. He only said, "Keep close to the house after dark." Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to nod. She wanted to ask why, but his tone left no room for questions. The conflict between them sharpened in those days. She bristled under his commands, her pride flaring each time he spoke in that quiet, certain way that expected obedience. And yet, when she pushed back, when her words came sharp with defiance, he did not raise his voice. He only looked at her, steady as ever, and said, "If you mean to stay, you'll have to learn." "Learn what?" she demanded one evening when her arms ached from hauling wood until the skin split on her palms. He met her anger with calm. "That this land won't bend for you? You bend for it, or it breaks you." She hated the truth in his words, hated that part of her knew he was right, but more than anything, she hated the thought of proving the townsfolk correct. So she bit her tongue, swallowed her pride, and rose again at dawn to face the same endless rhythm of labor. Still, the greater conflict pressed closer each night. The silence was too deep, the shadows too long. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, they heard the horses scream in the corral. Both of them ran, and she saw the animals thrashing, eyes wide, as if spooked by something unseen. The dog barked wildly at the cottonwoods, hackles raised. He calmed the horses with a steady hand and low voice, but his eyes remained fixed on the trees. She clutched the rail, her breath short, and whispered, "What was it?" His jaw tightened. Not tonight. The weight of what he left unsaid settled in her bones. Days turned into weeks. Still the whispers of danger grew louder. She found herself watching the tree line as much as she watched her chores. Sometimes when the wind was just right, she thought she heard voices, low, broken, drifting on the air. She never asked if he heard them too. She feared his answer as much as his silence. The deeper subplot was the growing bond neither of them spoke of. In the beginning, her stubbornness was meant to defy him, to prove she would not run. But slowly it shifted. She began to understand the way he moved, the way he read the land, the way his silence spoke louder than words. She saw, too, the burden he carried in his shoulders, the watchfulness that never left his eyes. One night, as the fire crackled low, she dared to ask, "Why do you stay here if the land is so hard?" He looked into the flames, his expression unreadable. "Because it's mine," he said simply. "Not by papers, not by law, but by blood, by memory. If I leave, I forget who I am." She held those words close, for they carried a weight she could not fully grasp, but they also deepened the mystery. If this land was bound to him by memory, then perhaps the dangers it carried were bound the same way. The tension reached. She sat upright in the dark, heart-pounding, and listened. The sound came from beyond the cottonwoods, distant at first, then closer, too many hooves to count. She looked across the cabin and found him already awake. Sitting on the edge of his bed with his rifle across his knees, he met her eyes, his expression grim, and whispered only one word: "Stay." Her breath caught as the hoofbeats thundered closer, then stopped all at once, as if the riders had vanished into the night. The silence that followed was heavier than anything she had yet felt. She clutched the quilt in her fists, every nerve alive with dread, and waited for whatever came next. But nothing came. The night stretched on, the silence unbroken, yet her heart knew the storm was only gathering by dawn. The cottonwoods stood as quiet as ever, but she could not shake the memory of the hoofbeats. She knew now, with a certainty that chilled her, that the whispers in town had not told the full truth. The challenge was not just surviving him, or the work, or the land. Something else was waiting out there, and it was getting closer. The morning after the hoofbeats, the air felt heavier than usual. Even the sunrise carried a muted tone, the light stretching thin and pale across the land, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise. She went about her chores with steady hands, but every sound seemed sharper, every shadow deeper. The silence of the prairie no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like something waiting. He spoke little, but she noticed his eyes returning again and again to the line of cottonwoods. When he walked the fence line that morning, he carried his rifle slung across his shoulder, and his steps carried the watchfulness of a man who expected trouble. She followed him a few paces behind, not because he asked her to, but because some instinct told her the danger was not his alone at the corral. The horses shifted restlessly, ears flicking, nostrils flaring at scents she could not catch. He placed a calming hand on the neck of the nearest mare, murmuring low words she did not understand. She realized then how deeply the animals trusted him, and how he, in turn, read their unease as though it were his own. "What was it last night?" she asked quietly. His hands stilled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Not yet," he said, his voice low. But soon, the answer gave her no comfort, but she held her tongue. She was beginning to understand his way. He spoke only when it mattered, and when he withheld, it was because the truth carried more weight than she was ready for. Still, each moment of silence pressed harder against her nerves. As the days stretched on, the tension grew unbearable. She caught herself staring at the cottonwoods in the evening, waiting for movement, waiting for the hoofbeats to return. Each time the wind stirred their branches, her heart leaped, and she gripped her apron tight, as though holding on to something solid. The townsfolk had begun. their murmurs again when she returned for supplies. She felt the weight of their stares, the curve of their whispers curling through the air. "Still there," someone muttered behind her back. "Never thought she'd last this long," another voice added. "Doesn't mean she'd last much longer." She ignored them as best she could, but the words burrowed deep. Each doubt was another stone on her shoulders, pressing heavier with every step. Yet, when she returned to the ranch and saw him standing tall against the horizon, silent and watchful, her resolve hardened again. She would not leave. Not now. One night, the unease broke into something sharper. The dog, usually stretched out at the foot of the porch, suddenly rose with his ears pinned and teeth bared. A low growl rumbled from his chest as he stared toward the cottonwoods. She froze at the sound, the hair along her arms lifting. He stepped outside. Rifle in hand, his gaze fixed on the same line of trees. The night was too still, too quiet, and her breath came shallow as she followed him onto the porch. "Stay inside," he said, not looking back. She shook her head before she could stop herself. Not without knowing, his jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Instead, he raised the rifle slowly, scanning the tree line as if expecting shadows to step into flesh. The dog barked suddenly, sharp and fierce, and for a moment she swore she saw something move between the trunks. A flicker, a shape too fast to name, gone before she could draw another breath. Her hand gripped the porch rail until her knuckles whitened. "You saw it?" she whispered. He lowered the rifle but kept his eyes on the trees. "I saw enough." Sleep was impossible that night. She lay awake listening for hoofbeats, for voices, for any sound to explain the dread curling in her stomach. The hours crawled, and when dawn finally came, it brought no relief. The sky was pale, the wind sharp, and the land stretched before them with the weight of something unseen pressing down. He worked with a quiet urgency that day. Fences were checked, supplies gathered, tools sharpened. His movements were brisk, purposeful, as though preparing for a storm he knew would come. She did her part beside him, though the work felt heavier than before. It was not just the strain on her body, it was the strain on her mind. Each task shadowed by the question of how long before the waiting ended. That evening, she found him near the corral, watching the horizon as the sun sank behind the hills. She stood beside him, the silence between them taut as wire. Finally, she asked, "Why don't you leave? If danger comes from out there, why not go where it can't reach?" He turned to her then, his eyes steady, dark with memory. "Because running only feeds it. The land doesn't forget, and neither do I." The answer sent a shiver through her. She understood then that whatever haunted the cottonwoods was not something he could walk away from. It was bound to him, tied to the soil, and by staying at his side, she had bound herself to it as well. That night, the storm finally came not with rain, but with fire in the sky. Lightning flashed along the ridge, splitting the darkness with blinding light. Thunder rolled low, shaking the ground, and with it came the sound she had dreaded, hoofbeats, dozens of them, pounding through the earth as though the land itself carried the charge. The dog barked wildly. The horses screamed in the corral, and her heart slammed against her ribs as she rushed to the doorway. He was already there, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the cottonwoods. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until it seemed they would crash through the cabin walls. Then, all at once, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. She clutched the frame of the door, her breath ragged, staring into the darkness. Between the flashes of lightning, she swore she saw figure shadows shaped like riders, waiting just beyond the trees. He stepped forward, every line of his body tense, his voice low and firm. "Stay inside," but she could not move. She felt rooted to the spot, caught between fear and the stubborn fire that had carried her this far. "If you face it, I will too," she said, her voice trembling but sure. For the first time since she had met him, his eyes softened. Just for a heartbeat, just enough to reveal that he understood the weight of her words. Then his gaze hardened again. He turned back toward the cottonwoods. The night stretched taut as a bowstring, lightning splitting the sky, thunder rolling low, the shadows waiting beyond the trees. She felt the land hold its breath, the air charged with something ancient and unyielding. The week the townsfolk had warned her of was long past. Yet now, standing on the threshold of the cabin, she realized the true test was only beginning. The whispers, the hoofbeats, the shadows, they had been only the edge of what was to come. She gripped the doorframe tighter, every nerve alive, and waited as the storm built higher, louder, closer. The climax was no longer a distant threat. It was here, pressing against the edge of the ranch, ready to break through at any moment. And when it did, nothing, not the land, not the silence, not even the unyielding man beside her would ever be the same again. The storm broke in a way she would never forget. Lightning tore open the sky, and for one blinding heartbeat, the shapes beyond the cottonwoods were clear riders. Dozens of them, formed from shadow and memory. They were not flesh, not men of blood and bone, yet their presence was heavy as stone. Hooves struck the earth without leaving marks, voices rose like echoes from another time, and the land itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of their return. She clutched the doorframe. Breath caught in her throat while he stepped forward into the rain of light and thunder. His rifle hung in his hand, but he did not raise it. Instead, he stood with the steadiness of one who had faced this before. She realized then that this was no sudden haunting, no new terror. This was the thing he had been watching for, guarding against. Carrying in his silence all along, the riders did not cross the line of the trees. They circled within the shadows, their figures flickering in and out with the strikes of lightning, their hoofbeats pounding like a drumbeat from another age. The sound pressed into her chest until her heart matched its rhythm. "They want to be remembered," he said at last, his voice carrying low but certain across the storm. "And if they are forgotten, they return." Her lips parted with questions, but the words would not come. He looked back at her then, the stormlight sharp in his eyes, and she saw the truth of his burden. The land was not only his to work, it was his to keep alive. The memory of those who came before, the weight of battles fought and lives lost, had settled in the soil. He had chosen to stay, to guard, so the echoes would not consume the living. She could have turned then. She could have begged him to leave it, to take her away from the shadows and the storms. But something inside her shifted. She had carried her own ghosts across the miles, left behind a life that no longer held her. And now, facing this storm with him, she knew she had not come west to run from hardship. She had come to meet it. She stepped down from the porch, the wind tearing at her hair, and stood beside him. The ground trembled beneath the phantom hoofbeats, the night alive with fire and sound. Her hand brushed against his arm, and though he did not look at her, his stance shifted. Together, they faced the riders. The storm raged on, but as the hours passed, the thunder moved farther down the ridge. The lightning grew less fierce, the hoofbeats fainter, until finally the night fell still. The cottonwoods stood dark and silent again, the only sound the ragged breath of the horses in the corral. The riders had gone for now. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, her body trembling as the quiet returned. He lowered the rifle, shoulders heavy, and turned toward the cabin. She followed the dog at their heels, both of them too drained for words. Inside, the fire had burned low. She sank onto the bench by the table, staring into the embers. He stood for a long time, silent as ever, before finally speaking. "They'll return again. Always." Her eyes lifted to him. "Then we'll face them again." Something in his gaze softened, just enough to let her see the weight of his solitude cracking. For so long, he had borne the burden alone, certain that no one would stay long enough to share it. Now, for the first time, he knew he was not alone. The days that followed carried a quiet shift. The land was no easier, the work no lighter, but something had changed between them. Where silence had once been a wall, now it was a thread binding them together. She still felt the watchful stares in town, still heard the whispers of how long she might last. But now, she carried the knowledge that she had already faced what others had never seen. She had stood through the storm, and she had not run. The animals grew calm again. The dogs settled, and the cottonwoods held their peace. Yet every evening, as the sun dipped low, she caught his eyes drifting to the horizon, watchful still. She knew now why. Memory lingered in the land, and forgetting was a danger greater than any outlaw or storm. In time, she began to see the land differently too. The dry earth, the endless labor, the silence of the night sit, was not cruelty, but demand. The land asked for everything a person had, and in return, it gave something rarer than comfort, belonging. She felt it in her blistered hands, in the ache of her back, in the way the wide horizon no longer made her feel small but steady. One afternoon, while hanging laundry on the line, she heard the distant laughter of children in the town carried by the wind. The sound struck her heart, soft and sharp at once. She thought of the women who had left, who had chosen an easier road, and she thought of herself. She realized she had found something here. Not in the promise of ease, but in the promise of endurance. When he returned from the fields that evening, dust clinging to his shirt and hair, she looked at him with new eyes. The townsfolk called him the Apache rancher, half in awe and half in fear. But she had come to know him as something deeper, a man who had chosen to hold memory against the weight of forgetting, a man who stood between the past and the present with no complaint, no praise. And now, he was no longer standing alone. As autumn drew close, the nights cooled, the stars grew sharper, and the first hints of frost touched the edges of the grass. Life did not grow easier, but it grew steadier. She worked the land, kept the fire, and stood beside him each evening when the wind rattled the cottonwoods. They spoke little, but words were not needed. The silence no longer pressed against her. It carried her. The riders did not return that season, but she knew they would. Someday the storm would come again, and when it did, they would face it together. The fear had not vanished, but fear was no longer her master. She had learned, as he had, that the land could not be bent, only endured, only shared. When winter came, the townsfolk noticed she was still there. Some stopped whispering, some began to nod respectfully when she passed, though others held on to their doubt. It no longer mattered. The ranch was her place now as much as it was his. One evening, as snow drifted lightly across the valley, she stood on the porch with him, watching the land settle into silence. The cottonwoods stood bare, their branches stark against the sky, and the horizon stretched endless and cold. She slipped her hand into his, not needing words. And for once he did not pull away. The wind carried no hoofbeats that night, only the whisper of snow. Yet she knew, as surely as she knew her own breath, that the riders would return someday. They were part of the land, part of the memory, just as she and he were now. She tightened her grip on his hand and felt him return it, steady and strong. For the first time since she had stepped off that wagon into the dust of the old American town, she knew she had found her place. Not because the life was easy, but because it demanded everything and gave belonging in return. The whispers of the town would fade. The storms would come again. But she would not leave. Not now, not ever. The week that no mail-order bride had ever survived had long passed, and she was still here. Still standing, still his, and in the silence of that wide, unyielding land. She finally understood the truth. She had not been brought here to escape the past. She had been brought here to carry it, to keep it alive. To share its weight, the prairie stretched before them, endless and untamed, and though shadows would return, so would they. Together. Always. The storm had tested her. The land had measured her, and the man had watched her. She had faced them all and remained. No mail-order bride lasted 1 week. With the Apache rancher until one strong woman refused to leave, and in the end she never did.